process to perform, helping you harness your potential on the way to greatness. I'm your host, Mike Wall. Thanks for listening. If you're enjoying the podcast, please rate and review it on Spotify or Apple iTunes, and of course, subscribe. Before we get started, I want to thank Matt Hayes again for joining us last week. I had a great discussion with him. He is currently the head of football operations for the XFL Seattle Dragons. A very thoughtful guy, worn a number of hats in his professional career, and I thought he had some very good advice and sound bites to give our aspiring athletes, as he is right now in charge of all things XFL Seattle Dragons. You know, Matt made a statement that winning is not an accident. And he was referencing some of the coaching personalities he'd been around. He talked about at length Jim Zorn, Doug Peterson, Jim Schwartz. And he was suggesting that the depth of understanding that goes into running their teams is so great that those coaches know exactly what levers they have to pull at an individual level, a group level, or on a team level in order to move the dial at any given time. And really, that in a nutshell is where I'd like to get every one of our listeners to on the individual level. I want to help you understand and appreciate all aspects of athlete development so you can make the best choices possible when building out your career game plan. Because success, like winning, it's not an accident. If your desire is to have a successful career, then it's worth the time to have a plan of attack, to have a framework to build out so that you can follow it when things are going poorly, or add to it when things are going well. On that line of thought, one of the things we talk about a ton on this podcast is routine development. Because committing to an improvement and fostering improvement over the long term is going to be just as important, if not more so, than an actual single unit of improvement. What I mean by that is going through the process and taking the time to plan out your attack and stay committed to what you're doing is going to develop character traits that allow you to improve on a myriad of things over the long term. What's powerful about routine development is that it allows you to accomplish those long-term goals, and it develops that mental side of becoming a complete athlete, but it also helps you accomplish those short to medium-term goals, such as what you want to get accomplished during the next season. Because at the highest levels between training, traveling, prep work, and actual competition, there really isn't much time for anything else if you're committing yourself fully to being the best that you can be. I remember listening to the Hall of Fame wide receiver Cris Carter early in my career. He was playing for the Vikings, and he had a great viewpoint on routine development and the discipline that comes along with that, and then how that transfers to the field. He was saying, he sees a lot of young guys coming into the league now, and they're trying to live that life. They're going out, they're partying, they're making sure they get, seen on television. They're drinking, they're doing the whole thing. And every night they're doing that during the season. He's at home with his kids. He's watching film. He's recovering. He's getting his sleep. He's eating right. He's studying the playbook. And it was like, he would laugh and say, well, how do you, I'm already really good. Like, how do you expect to beat me if you're not willing to commit to the routine that I'm willing to commit to for this 6-7 month season in order to be the best that I can be? And that always kind of stuck with me at an early age of, most of us are marginal athletes at the level that we're at. Let's be honest. Whatever level you're at, you're probably an average to above average athlete. Very, very few of us out there are elite, and certainly at the Cris Carter level, there's even fewer that are kind of the elite of the elite. And so if you're not willing to commit to a routine that enables you to be the best version of yourself day in and day out, what is the expectation for you when you go up against somebody that is willing to do that? So now that we've established a pattern of expectations and a foundation for development, I'd really like to explain the rest of that mastery of craft pyramid I talked about back in episodes 1 and 2. I hope players, parents, and coaches can use it as a guide or a punch list when they're assessing the current state of their careers. As we go through the mastery of craft pyramid, understand the principles behind every building block are not going to change because of age, but what will change is the weight that you put on each building block as you continue to refine and prioritize things in your career. Now, I acknowledge that this pyramid is heavily directed towards team sports. That's what I grew up on. That's how I made my mark. But those individuals who compete alone in the spotlight, the wrestlers, X Games participants, they're going to see parallels to their journey here, and I will address each block as it applies to both scenarios. I'll put a link in the notes to the unrivaledsystems.com website where you can download a PDF of this Mastery of Craft pyramid. Sometimes I find it easier to follow along when you have that visual aid as well. Up to you, but it will be in the notes. To recap, in episode 2, we went through the non-negotiable character traits that serve as kind of the cement or the glue for this Mastery of Craft pyramid. We talked about things like competitive mindset, confidence, presence, coachability, and the willingness to take short-term pain for long-term gain. Now, without these non-negotiable traits, and I think those non-negotiable traits will have some carryover into other aspects of your life, it's very difficult to build a solid foundation. From there, we moved on to my favorite subject, which is technique. Technique is the cornerstone of your development. It's the foundational building block of this Mastery of Craft pyramid. We talked about direct and ancillary benefits of technique and how technique can really drive that equation of improved technique equals improved decision-making, which allows you to execute scheme at a higher level. The next block above technique, and this is the one that Matt Hayes talked about a lot, was foundational knowledge. And that's having a master's in understanding what is required of you per your sport. Now, this will change by age and obviously the sport you play, but foundational knowledge is really a deep understanding of what you are supposed to do given any set of circumstances. In fluid sports, this is built around a framework, like basketball's motion offense or soccer's defensive rotation. In rehearsed sports, things like gymnastics, the X Games, rock climbing, knowing your routine cold, being able to go on autopilot with that part of your brain so you can focus on the feedback from your hands or your feet, your core. I look at this as an extension of foundational technique. So if technique is a singular event, then foundational knowledge is the understanding about how to accumulate and prioritize those single events in competition. I think a good way to illustrate this point is to look at maybe the halfpipe competition in X Games for a skateboarder. A pro skateboarder has that foundational knowledge, so that pro skateboarder knows a ton of technical tricks, but they also know that doing a ton of like big air isn't going to get them the highest mark. There's an ebb and a flow to their routine. There's a momentum they have to build up, not only literally with the skateboard, but also with the routine. So there's a ton of kind of rail technical tricks they have to do. They understand what is required from a scoring standpoint in order to get to the podium. And so that foundational knowledge allows them to build out a routine that's not only hitting all the touch points required for success in that competition, but also makes sense in the kind of the mechanics and the physics of how one navigates the actual terrain. And rounding off what I would call, the basic requirements of success in this part of the pyramid. So you have your foundational technique, your foundational knowledge, and then on top of that, 6 consistent routines. And we talked about it earlier, we've talked about it for weeks, developing individual routines, because routines free us to focus on what's important while we are in the moment. Using routines helps me focus on the things that are important to me in that day, because I don't have to worry about when they're going to happen, how I'm going to make them happen. I know what time I'm going to be somewhere, what is required of me in that situation, and I can now focus all my energy on being the best version of myself during that time of the day. The best thing about having a consistent routine is in those times that you have to break your routine, you can quickly get back in the saddle. So just as you have a strong technical foundation that allows you to adjust to a situation, a consistent routine gives you a solid foundation to adjust off of when circumstances call for it. People that have exercised on a consistent basis will find this to be very true. So if you spend 5-6 days a week exercising, and you decide that on a Tuesday you're going to take your family to the beach, or you're going to go to Disneyland and eat an extra one of those giant turkey legs, that's not really going to ruin the rest of your week. You get on board with your routine the next day, and because you have that consistency, because your body just and your mind just kind of go back to what is been planned before, it's nothing more than a very, very slight speed bump, and it's sometimes something that's a necessary attraction for the day-to-day monotony. On the other hand, if you don't have a consistent routine and you decide to take some random days off, those days can one day can turn into another, and before you know it, you haven't seen the gym in 4 or 5 days. So now that we've touched on the basic requirements for success, I'd like to get into what I guess Maslow would consider your psychological needs of who we are and how we fit into the system, and then who our opponents are. So the first level in this area is conceptual knowledge of scheme. Conceptual knowledge, as opposed to foundational knowledge, is a thorough understanding of every working part in the equation. As a player in a team sport, this means you know where everybody's supposed to be on the field, but you also know why you're running the play, why you're running the scheme, or why you're in that framework. What is it doing? How is it stressing the defense? Who are you trying to take advantage of? And then obviously you need to know how specifically you interact with everybody else to make that relationship happen. You also understand what the opposing team is trying to take away from you, and you know what dials to turn in the event adjustments need to be made because something unforeseen has happened. Now, as I've said before on this podcast, process to perform is a mixture of the accumulated experiences of my life, accumulated experiences from subject matter experts that I talk to, and then research-backed science. But conceptual knowledge of scheme in particular, it's a byproduct of observing one of my former teammates. Frank Winters was the starting center for the Green Bay Packers. I think he was a 14 or 15-year guy. He was the veteran presence in the room. When I got there as a rookie, he had started for a number of those Super Bowl teams, and he was kind of one of the people you thought about when you thought about the Green Bay Packers. And I'll never forget, it was a late November game, and kind of the season in November is the doldrums of the NFL season. You're not quite ready to make that playoff run, and you're in week 10, week 11. And so on Fridays, usually the head coach or the offensive coordinator comes up and he installs the red zone offense. And so the entire offense is sitting in the room. We come up, and Mike Holmgren's the coach at the time, and he says, today Frank Winters, and this has never happened before, at least in my experience, he says, you know what, I'm tired of this. I'm going to let Frank Winters come up and run red zone. And my first thought is, like, everyone's ears perk up. Mine do too, because I'm a rookie. I don't know much. And I'm thinking, God, I can't imagine if he asked me to come up, it'd be a complete disaster. So when you talk about people that would understand the entire offense, you start with the head coach and offensive coordinator, probably the position coaches, and then maybe from a player's perspective, you think about the quarterback, but certainly not. Nobody's expectation was that Frank would stand up and know every single route combination cold, blocking schemes cold, line calls cold, what defenses were looking for and why. But that's exactly what he did. He got up and gave maybe the most impressive red zone presentation from memory that I had ever seen. He can recall on most of the instances when we ran the play against what team in what situation, and usually the ones he recalls is when like something bad happened, like we threw a pick or we dropped a ball, and it's usually one of his buddies that is the offender. So really, really entertaining day. But I just remember going, God, it struck me that Frank's knowledge level is so much higher than mine, and that's needed to be my standard. My standard had to be, I need to have this conceptual knowledge of what's going on in entirety. And I had such a long way to go. So conceptual knowledge of scheme really stuck with me at an early age. You can't be a complete player, and you can't play at maximum speed if you don't have a really good understanding of what's supposed to be happening, not only in your little bubble, but across the entire playing field. Now, we're stacking these building blocks, and I hope that everyone can notice that every building block builds on the foundational block before it. So technical mastery improves your ability to acquire foundational knowledge. Consistent routines will maintain and improve your foundational qualities while becoming a PhD in that scheme or framework. One thing that's important is the basic requirements of success. Those first three technique, foundational knowledge, and consistent routines, young athletes need to be completely focused on those from the jump. Be a technical expert, have a good understanding of what's going on, what's required of you, and start developing your routines so you can reinforce all these good habits that you can learn in an early age, which we've talked about before, makes your ceiling so much higher over the long run. Now, as you gain experience, moving into a master's level of understanding the concepts and personnel takes you, in military terms, it takes you kind of from a soldier's view to a general's view of the battlefield. And continuing along that military anecdote, the next level of our pyramid is an intimate view of your opponent. So once you have an understanding of your opponent's strategy and prior behaviors, as competitors, we want to know exactly what the tendencies are of the people we will meet in a 1v1 matchup. So we want a general's understanding of the big picture, but a special ops understanding of the individual opponent. In a sport like basketball, this would be, what's your opponent's favorite spot on the court? What moves they like to do from there? How do they like to start the game? Do they like to feel out the referee? Are they going to be super aggressive, or are they going to play stand back and let the game come to them? One of my favorite scenes from the movie Hoosiers that encapsulates this well is when Gene Hackman tells the defender to figure out what kind of bubble gum his opponent's chewing that game. In my sport, you can tell a ton of information about a defender's intentions by how they get into their pre-snap position. So things like foot position, weight distribution, and their eyes all tell a story. And from there, it becomes a question of what can a defender do from there, and what are they not capable of doing from that position? What have I not seen from them given a set of circumstances? In a confrontational sport, it's worth a considerable amount of time to study and best understand what your opponent likes to do so you can take that first, second, third option away. As this pertains to non-confrontational sports, and let's take golfing as an example, the top-level golfer has a plan for each hole off the tee. And then they've done enough research to understand where they need to make adjustments if things don't go as planned. And as they get closer to the hole, a golfer's understanding of the roll and the pitch of the green are going to determine their comfort in going for the shot or playing it safe. A more extreme example of this would be a competitive downhill mountain biker. Now imagine a mountain biker flying off the side of a cliff, completely blind to what's next. Those people do an incredible amount of additional legwork in understanding each crevice and pitch in the cliff in that downhill slope because their well-beings are at stake. And without that kind of knowledge, it's impossible to free yourself up, do the tricks that you're required to win the X Games with, go down at the speed you need to win the race with. You can't do all that if you don't have the right amount of information, or at least you can't do it consistently over a long period, because what's going to happen if you don't know the course, you're going to get hurt. And so now that we've earned the right to play well, we've mastered our technique, our understanding of the game, our routines are detailed and consistent. We've spent a considerable time developing our conceptual knowledge scheme and studying our opponent intimately. This place, on a very different level from everyone else on the planet, is somewhere around where Michael Jordan was before he started winning championships. Individually, he was the best player on the planet. But his limitation was that he had not developed trust in teammates. When Phil Jackson arrived and trusting his teammates became a point of emphasis, Michael Jordan was able to solidify his place as the greatest player of all time. Developing trust in your teammates is the final step before becoming a master of your craft. Now, trust happens at different points in different sports. I remember watching the U.S. women's national team win the World Cup last year, and one thing that always stood out to me was how they trust each other and how much they talk about trusting each other and saying, I knew that so-and-so was going to make a run to the front post, and I knew she was going to be there. I knew. They're always so confident in each other, and that really, you can tell that just propels them to success. Now, looking at maybe an individual sport like boxing, you have to have this really, MMA is probably the easiest because we've all seen and heard the fighters' corners talking while these two guys are in the cage battling it out. You have to have this intimate trust in your trainer and your training staff. And trust is easy in preparation phase, right? Where I'm just telling you what to do. I'm telling you where to be, how to do it. But when bullets are flying, so to speak, when you're getting hit in the face, when panic's setting in, when it's getting fuzzy around the fringes, do you have a trust in your training? Are you willing to listen and do exactly what they say? Because that is the recipe for success. And that trust has to be earned. That's something that you don't just walk in and that happens overnight, even if you have a great rapport in any of these circumstances. At the pinnacle of the Master of Craft pyramid is perpetual supremacy. It's a place in your athletic career where you're competing with the earned expectation to win every encounter. It takes years of dedicated practice, focused study, and disciplined routines to get to a place where you can go into every matchup expecting to win the day. Now, we cannot control many things in sports, as in life, but as individual contributors to an experience, we can put ourselves in a position to consistently compete with the expectation of success. As an aspiring athlete or a parent, I hope that these steps towards the ultimate goal of becoming a master of your craft help you focus your efforts on getting to the next level. As an exercise, I'd advise you to take time and draw up your own pyramid or rewrite this one using words and phrases that are unique to you. Take ownership of your career. Take ownership of that planning portion of your career. Any questions you have, hit me up on @UnrivaledESS on Twitter or info@unrivaledsystems.com. Now that I've explained my framework, now that we've talked about this Mastery of Craft pyramid for developing the entire athlete, I'm going to spend the next couple of weeks looking at specific areas of opportunity. The next one is going to be behavioral cueing and how that can affect performance in in-game situations. All right, this was Process to Perform. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm your host, Mike Wall. Talk to you next week.